All right, so many years ago, in a land far away, there was a king named Nimrod. And I'm not talking about anybody specific. There was actually a guy whose name was King Nimrod. King Nimrod had a very valued and trusted advisor, and his name was Terah. And now Terah was a very influential man in his area, a very influential man in his time, because Terah was an idol manufacturer. His sole purpose is that he would decide what idols needed to be worshipped, and then he would craft them and sell them. And so once again, a place of high importance. And the king Nimrod valued his advice above no else. But one day, Terah was getting ready to have a son. And the day before the son was to be born, King Nimrod's advised him from his astrologers, some of the prophets and his sages, or whatever they were called. They came to him and said, "King, Terah's son that's about to be born is going to be a great man. He's going to be a father of many nations. And his very existence is going to be a threat to your kingdom." Now Nimrod is very afraid. And so Nimrod calls Terah and he says, "Terah, I need to speak to you." And as Terah comes, he says, "Listen, this is what I've heard. This son of yours is going to be a father of many nations. And his life is going to be a threat to my kingdom. When your child is born, I need you to bring him to me so I can kill him." And Terah says, "Sure thing, king. Not a problem. Will do." The problem was, up until that point, he hadn't held his son yet. And so when his son, Abram, was born, he held him in his hands and he said, "There's no way I can take him to be killed by the king." Lucky for Terah, he had a servant that on the same day Abram was born, had a son born as well. So, without Nimrod knowing, he just took the son from the servant, brought it to King Nimrod. And King Nimrod took this day-old baby boy and killed him with his bare hands. But now Terah had to figure out, what do I do with my son? If Nimrod finds out that I have deceived him, he will surely kill me. So they take this baby boy and they abandon him into a cave. Now there's different stories and there's different versions as to what happened next. Some of those stories say that at night and in secret, Terah and his wife would sneak off and feed the baby and tend to the baby. Some say that they completely forgot him altogether. But no matter what story you follow, the angel Gabriel would appear in the cave and provide milk for this baby to drink. And now when Abram was 3 years old, he ventured out of the cave. And it was dark out. And he looked upon the sky and he saw all these twinkling lights, millions of twinkling lights. Because imagine how many stars you would see in the Middle East then, as opposed to today when there's so much pollution in the air that stops what we're able to see. So the sky is as clear as can be. The millions of twinkling little lights, and he says, "Man, look at all these little lights. These must be our gods. Let us bow down and worship these millions of twinkling little lights." But then, as dawn came, the twinkling little lights disappeared. He thought, "Oh, I guess those are not God." But then upon the horizon, this giant ball of light began to rise up in the sky, and it was overpowering the millions of little twinkling lights. And he says, "Ah, that must be God. I will bow down and worship the sun." But then as the day moved, the sun began to fade. And there was another great light that showed up on the horizon, the moon. And he says, this great light has overpowered the other great light. This great light must be God. And at that time, the angel Gabriel appeared to him and said, listen, there is but one God, the God who created the entire universe and all things in it, and there's only one God that is to be worshipped, and his name is Yahweh. And so Abraham realized that that is the one true God, and the only God that is to be worshipped is Yahweh, who is the creator of all things. Now, when Abraham was 10 years old, well, this time he was Abram, but you know what I'm talking about. Terah realizes that King Nimrod has completely forgotten about that entire situation. He completely forgotten about this prophecy that was told to him. He completely forgot that he had murdered a baby with his bare hands. Because he's so self-obsessed with his own being that he doesn't realize, he doesn't know how many kids Terah has. And so Terah feels safe bringing Abram back to the family. And so they go to the cave and they bring Abram back and they reconcile Abram to the family. And then one day, Terah has to go away on business. And Abram, as a 10-year-old, was left in charge of his father's store. And so one day a guy comes into the store to purchase an idol. And Abram says to the guy, how old are you? And the guy says, I'm 60. He says, so why do you worship something that was made yesterday? You've been alive for 60 years and you're going to worship something that was made yesterday? And now the man was filled with shame. Like, oh my gosh, this little kid's right. Why do I worship things that were made yesterday? And he left the store. Another day, a lady walks in with a basket of bread. And she says, I would like to sacrifice this bread to the idols to ensure that my family has enough food to get through the year. And so Abraham now grabs a hammer and he smashes all the idols in the store but one. And he places the hammer into the hand of the biggest idol. And now his father returns. His father says, what happened? What went on here? And Abraham said, well, this lady brought this loaf of bread to sacrifice, and I put it before the idols, and they began to fight over it. And this one grabbed a hammer and smashed all the other ones and ate the bread. And the father says, what are you trying to pull here, Abram? These things can't do that. They don't have minds. And Abram said, Father, listen to what your mouth is saying. These things have no power at all. Why do you worship them? Now his father is like, whoa. Luckily my kids aren't old enough yet to ask me questions that I don't know how to answer, right? I'm sure some of us have been there. Kids come home and they ask you a question and you're like, we're going to go to church, talk to the pastor. Well, guess what? That's what Terah did. Terah said, we're going to go talk to King Nimrod. He'll get you straightened out. He'll explain all of this stuff to you. Well, now, Nimrod's God was fire. Nimrod worshipped fire, and that was his God. And so when Abram was brought to Nimrod, Nimrod said to him, you will worship fire. And Abram said, okay, but doesn't water extinguish fire? So shouldn't we worship water? And King Nimrod was like, you know what? You're right. We're going to worship water. But then Abram said, okay, yeah, good, yeah, that's what we'll do. But wait a second. Don't the clouds carry water? So shouldn't we be worshiping the clouds? And Nimrod said, you know what? You're right. We're going to worship clouds. From now on, we're worshiping clouds. We're cloud worshipers. And Abram said, yes. But wait. Doesn't the wind, the ruach, the spirit, push the clouds through the air? So shouldn't we be worshiping the wind or the spirit, the ruach? And Nimrod said, yeah, you know what? You're right. We're going to worship the wind. Now Abram said, okay, but hold on. Don't we as human beings have the ability to impede the wind? And Nimrod said, well, yeah, I guess we as human beings have the ability to impede wind. Amen. So then shouldn't we be worshiping human beings? Now Nimrod finally caught on. Because once again, that's why Nimrod is used for somebody who's not very bright, right? What a Nimrod. Because finally Nimrod caught on. He said, wait a second. You're being funny with words. I'm on to you. No. I am not going to be tricked by a 10-year-old. What we're going to do now is we're going to go back to worshiping fire, and I'm going to have a furnace built, and I'm throwing you in the furnace because you've made a fool of me. You're a king. And so as Nimrod commanded, a furnace was built. And the furnace was set on fire. And Abram was thrown into the fire. But the fire did not hurt Abram. And actually, some of the stories suggest that as Abram was thrown into the fire, all the logs in the fire turned into trees that began to blossom and bear fruit. There's a passage in Genesis that talks about how Terah had another son who was murdered, who was killed. Some of the stories suggest that when Abram was thrown into the furnace and the trees turned in, or the burning logs turned into trees that blossomed and bear fruit, that Nimrod was very perplexed and was wondering, okay, what is going on here? And so they built another furnace, and they threw Abraham's brother into the furnace, and he died. Abram was special. Abram had been called by God and created. Now, there's a lot of things in this story that we can really focus on. There's a few of them that really stand out to me. At a very young age, Abram was disconnected from his society and his family. So Abraham didn't receive a lot of the indoctrination and the religious upbringing that those around him were exposed to. He wasn't brought up in this religious idol-worshiping culture in which the rest of his family was brought up in. He was raised in a cave by the angel Gabriel. And the angel Gabriel was able to explain to him the truth in the way that hadn't been clouded by tradition and culture. And so when Abraham was brought back into this family, he was able to see the religious traditions from an outside perspective and was able to look at them and say, do you realize what you're actually doing? Do you realize what's going on here? And Abraham was able to point out some of the flaws inside of the religious institution and their culture because he had a view from it from the outside. And this is why many corporations, when they go to hire managers, they tend to hire about 60 to 40% of their management staff is outside hires because they want fresh eyes. They want somebody who wasn't brought up, who didn't work their way up through that company and only knows that company. They want somebody with fresh eyes that can come into the company and say, maybe we're doing some things wrong here. Another part of the story that stands out to me is how we spend so much of our time compartmentalizing so many different things. So many people want to just focus on the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. We just want to figure out what the cross, what the crucifixion is. Was it penal substitutionary atonement? Was it Christus Victor? Was it satanic payment theory? Was all these different atonement theories that want to figure out what the crucifixion was? And so this last week, somebody posted an article, is the crucifixion necessary to be in the kingdom of God? Is faith in the crucifixion necessary to be in the kingdom of God? And I responded and I said, no, it's not. Because Paul says it's not our faith in the crucifixion that saves us, it's our faith in the resurrection that saves us. But wait, you can't have a resurrection if you don't first have a crucifixion. But wait, you can't have a crucifixion if you first don't have a life. But wait, you can't have a life if you don't first have a birth. So instead of focusing on one element of creation, the stars or the sun or the moon, the angel Gabriel comes to Abraham and says, look, focus on the whole thing. All of it is God's creation. All of it is the perfect and completed work of the cosmic Christ. We focus just on the crucifixion, we're missing the resurrection, we're missing the life, we're missing the birth. But then, we're coming into December, when so many of our brothers and sisters outside the church, all they want to focus on is the birth. All we care about is the birth of Jesus that did not take place December 25th. All we want to celebrate is the birth of Jesus Christ that did not take place in the winter. We don't care about the life that he lived. We just want to get presents. We just want a reason to go out and blow money on stuff. We just want a reason to get drunk with our family and eat a bunch of food and get fat. We don't actually care about what Jesus said and what Jesus did in his life. We don't really care about what happened on the cross or what transpired in the grave. We want to compartmentalize things instead of looking at the wholeness, the completed work that Jesus Christ accomplished while he was on earth. Abraham coming into his family, coming and saying, look, you make these idols and you worship these idols. These idols have been born for an entire day. The God who created the universe is infinite. He was never born. He always was. Why you worship these things that somebody... Now God created the man that created the idol. You're just worshiping the idol. Well, shouldn't we be worshiping the man that created the idol? Shouldn't we be worshiping the God that created the man that created the idol? And so we begin to just realize how compartmentalized our faith is and how fragmentized it is sometimes, instead of looking at the whole thing. The cosmic Christ, the cosmic creation that allows all of us to exist and breathe and move and have our being. Has anybody ever heard this story of Abraham before? Why not? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Someone sound familiar? You've heard of Terah before, right? Nobody ever read Genesis? Terah's name shows up a lot in Genesis. Heard of Nimrod before, right? We've all heard of Nimrod because many of us don't know where Nimrod comes from. We just go around calling people Nimrods. Like, I think Loretta's called me a Nimrod like at least half dozen times today. But all of us have heard of Abram and Abraham. That name's familiar to us. This story is not found in our scriptures. This is an ancient Jewish story. It's found in what's called the Midrash or the Talmud, both. But several times in our scriptures, this story is alluded to. Our scriptures, our Genesis story, and even some of the later on, some of the prophets in the Old Testament reference this story. And so now, when we're reading those, we're just like, we don't even realize it's a reference. Because I'm up here and I talk a lot about TV shows, because I watch a lot of TV shows. And you guys don't watch a lot of TV shows, I guess. So a lot of the TV shows I reference, you don't know because you don't watch the TV show. Right? And so our scriptures are referencing stories that we don't know, because we've never been exposed to those stories, because we're told that this is a completed work, and that everything we will ever need to know is found in here. It's a good book. It tells a complete story from Genesis to Revelation. We're told a story. But is that story everything we're ever going to need to know? So many of us, so many times, we've taken this book, we've taken the cross down, And we put this book in its place. We worship at the altar of the Bible instead of the altar of the cross. This is a complete work. It's a complete story. But it's not the whole story. And there's value in tapping into other traditions, especially when that tradition is the entire basis of our tradition. Maybe we can learn a thing or two from some ancient Jewish literature that informs us more about our story, that helps us better understand who our God is, who we are, how we are to live life inside of the world in which God created for us to live in. This is a beautiful story of Abraham. Is it a literal story? I don't know. But it's a true story. There's a whole lot of, we talked last week about truth. The story contains loads of truth. But it's not found in our Bible. Does that matter? Does that make it bad? Does that make it not true? Does it make it wrong? Or do none of those words apply, and it's just a story that can help illustrate to us that maybe sometimes it's good to step out of our own tradition and look at it from an outside objective eye and say, what are we doing wrong? Does it make sense that I worship an idol that's less than a day old when I'm 60? Does it make sense that we worship fire that can be extinguished by water? Or we worship water that's carried in a cloud, or a cloud that's moved by wind, or wind that's blocked by a human? Or do we just realize that all of it, the fire, the water, the clouds, and the wind, and the humans, all work together in unity inside of God's creation, and God, the creator of that unity, is what we worship, not the individual elements of the creation? Is it sometimes beneficial for us to look outside of our own culture, outside of our own tradition, and say, are they doing something? Are they onto something that maybe we could better understand? Especially, like I said, when that culture is the very premise, and that tradition is the very premise of ours. Because we worship the same God that Abraham was taught about in that cave. The same God that Angel Gabriel showed up and told Abraham about is the same God that we worship, the same God that we believe in. Abraham is the father of many nations. His descendants outnumber the sand on the beach, and his descendants outnumber the stars in the sky. Abraham is the father of all creation. Oh, wait, hold on. I think I said that wrong. But you get the point. I definitely said that wrong. But you get the point. Abraham's the father of many nations, not creation. God's the father of creation. I did mess that up. Okay. But I caught it, though. That's a good thing. Would that have been possible? Would Abraham have been able to be what he was supposed to be if he wasn't abandoned in a cave for 10 years? If he was brought up inside of that tradition, had all of that stuff indoctrinated in him, the idol pagan worship that was so prevalent in his day. Not saying that God couldn't have overcome it. Not saying that God caused Abraham to be abandoned. Not saying that God wanted that one-day-old baby to be murdered at the hands of Nimrod. But everything that happened in a way in which Abram was able to become Abraham, the father of many nations, whose descendants outnumber the sand on the beach and the stars in the sky. So, maybe it's okay that every once in a while your pastor gets up and preaches you a sermon that's not out of the Bible, but is out of our tradition, and is out of people who are in our tradition that we don't always recognize and acknowledge. Because there's a great story about Abram that we may not have known if we hadn't stepped out of our tradition and heard a story from somebody else's tradition that greatly affects our tradition and is referenced numerous times in our own very sacred scriptures. Does that make sense to you? So I want you to remember the story of Abram and how he grew. And maybe when we read now the story in Genesis, and we can see how Abram was so willing to sacrifice his own son before God. How when God called Abraham and said, get up and leave and go, he was so willing to go. He had such a trust and such a faith in Yahweh. Now we can begin to piece that picture of saying, yeah, but why did he have so much faith? Because as an infant, he was abandoned in a cage and was sustained by that very God. That very God saved him when he was thrown into a furnace. That very God enabled him to make fools of the adults in his life. I'm not saying that that's our goal. Children, don't make fools of your parents. But anyway, it's a beautiful story about our father Abraham. And he had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. And I am one of them, and so are you.